To start at the beginning, well, in the beginning, America had no foreign policy. That is, the United States had no foreign policy because there was no United States. The American colonies were part of the British Empire, and so their foreign policy was whatever the foreign policy of the British Empire was. The Americans were quite constrained in their ability to deal with countries other than Britain. So their trade possibilities with the French West Indies, for example, or with the Dutch or with anybody else, had to be routed largely through Britain. And Britain had a series of laws, navigation acts, that said who the Americans could trade with and under what circumstances. So that was the situation until the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is America's first statement of foreign policy. Now, from the standpoint of the United States, it's a very large aspect of domestic policy. We are this independent country. We are these United States of America. But it was a statement, the Declaration was a statement to the world. It was partly to Britain, but it was to the world as to why these colonies are now independent states. And it had in mind engaging in a rather ambitious foreign policy for a newly independent country. And that foreign policy was to find powerful friends abroad. The first concern of the United States government under its new regime was to find an ally, in particular to get France on America's side. So if you start from the beginning in 1776, the first important, you could call it the indispensable goal of American foreign policy was to get France on America's side in the war against Britain. And this was the fundamental goal of American diplomacy for the first 2 years of the war. This culminated successfully in an alliance with France. And the alliance with France began in 1778. At the time, the American diplomats, led by Benjamin Franklin, were in no position to argue about the terms of the treaty, and they were just willing to sort of take whatever terms of alliance they could. One of the things they did not do was to put a term limit on this alliance. This was important. Again, it was something that they couldn't do going in because France really held all the cards, and the French they really didn't like the idea that the Americans might change their minds or Britain might offer the United States moderate, attractive peace terms, because as soon as France allied with the United States, it meant that France was at war with Britain. Now, this was no new deal for Britain or for France. The two countries had been at odds with each other for, if one went back to the Norman invasion of 1066, you could say all the way back then, but from the 1690s until, now we're in the 1770s, there had been one series of wars between Britain and France after another. Anyway, so America's first venture in foreign policy was to find a foreign ally. It found the foreign ally, and it was with France and with the indispensable aid of France that the United States became independent. So, goal one of American foreign policy, win your independence by virtue of the alliance with France. Succeeded. And in 1783, the United States signed the Treaty of Paris with Britain, by which Britain acknowledged American independence. The United States was free of Britain. Unfortunately, it wasn't free of France because this Treaty of Alliance was open-ended. There was no termination clause. And so the United States found itself allied with France. Initially, no big deal because the end of the war with Britain meant the end of the war between Britain and France, and so, okay, just cruise right along. But what is soon going to happen is that Britain and France are going to resume their wars. Now, the trigger this time was the French Revolution, which began in 1789, but within a few years, it triggered a war between France and Britain and other countries of Europe. The other countries of Europe were concerned that the French revolutionary contagion would spread to their countries, and France, anticipating or imagining attempts on the part of the European countries to crush the revolution in France, many in those other European countries did want to crush the revolution in France, the French declared war, and war begins. So now the United States finds itself in a position where it has to maneuver between these countries at war because, well, the outbreak of the wars of the French Revolution in the early 1790s led to a number of things. It led well, one of the things it led to was the development of political parties in the United States. There hadn't been political parties. Everybody who was involved in the founding of the United States and the drafting of the Constitution hoped there would not be political parties. Political parties were the bane, they thought, of British existence, and they thought that political parties were beneath the civic virtue of a republic like the United States. But when the wars in Europe began, then American partisans of France, and there were the Francophiles in the United States, led by Thomas Jefferson, a great admirer of France, who thought that the United States ought to take the side of France. After all, it still had this Treaty of Alliance with France. There were others, led by Alexander Hamilton, who thought that no, America's future lay in a much closer relationship with Britain. After all, the United States inherited most of its institutions, its expectations, its law, its practices, everything else from Britain, the language from Britain and all that. And so despite having been, or not despite, maybe because America had been British colonies, they still were a lot like Britain, and America's future lay in the direction of Britain. So this split over, should the United States back France in the wars in Europe, or Britain in the wars in Europe, caused the creation of political parties in the United States. Jefferson's Republicans, as they called themselves, they said we ought to cozy up to France. Hamilton's Federalists said, no, Britain is the one we ought to go with. Now, George Washington, first president of the United States, thought himself above political parties. He identified as neither a Republican nor a Federalist, although he leaned much more closely to the Federalists in philosophy and point of view than toward the Republicans. But nonetheless, George Washington proclaimed neutrality for the United States in this war. There's no constitutional basis for a president declaring neutrality. In fact, there's no constitutional basis for a Congress declaring neutrality. Congress can declare war. One might say, okay, from that follows the proclamation of neutrality, but Congress didn't. Washington took it on himself to declare neutrality, and this was okay for most people in the United States. Jefferson really didn't want to go to war on the side of France, and most Americans didn't want to get involved in another war. But Americans discovered that they were soon involved in the war. And this gives rise to the first of two abiding principles of American foreign policy during America's first almost century. Number one is, and not in this particular order, number one, I'll call it. Number one is the preservation of neutral rights, the rights of the United States as a neutral in conflicts in Europe, to have the right to trade with the countries at war, have ordinary relations with the countries at war despite the ongoing war. This was a struggle for American foreign policy, for American diplomacy, from the 1790s certainly through into the 1810s, because France and Britain were constantly at war. And each side in that war had an incentive to try to deny American trade to the other and to engage in other practices that would benefit them. The British, for example, they blockaded French ports and seized American ships that were headed in that direction. They also seized American sailors for use in the British Navy. And so this was a source of great aggravation on the part of the United States, on the part of Americans. And many Americans, especially those in Jefferson's Republican Party, thought this is terrible. The United States ought to be prepared to go to war against Britain if necessary. On the other hand, the French did pretty much the same thing. They seized American ships. The one thing they didn't do is to seize American sailors because they couldn't very well claim that American sailors speaking English were really Frenchmen who had deserted from the French Navy. They would have had to speak French. Whereas the British could say, you really were a British deserter, and the accent of the languages was close enough in those days that you could plausibly say that somebody who was from Virginia or from Georgia had actually been a British citizen. In fact, some of them really had been British citizens. But whereas the United States acknowledged naturalization, the right to switch your allegiance, to come to the United States, swear allegiance to the United States and become an American citizen, and then incur the protections of American law, the British did not acknowledge this right of naturalization. And so from the British standpoint, if you were a British citizen once, you were a British citizen forever. And so there were these, weren't citizens, they were subjects, but there were these British subjects under British law who were sailing on board American ships. And the British took upon themselves the right to seize them. Anyway, this question of neutral rights would put the United States almost on the brink of war with Britain when the Republicans were in charge, almost on the brink of war with France when the Federalists were in charge. In fact, the United States went to a half war called the QuasiWar at the time. It was a naval war in the late 1790s. The Federalists were in charge, and they were opposed to France, and so it was the United States against France. The outcome of this was that at the end of it, the U.S. and France sort of declared an end to these naval battles and also an end to the American alliance. Now this is important because with the end of the French alliance, the end of the French-American alliance, Americans mostly said, almost unanimously, they said, this business of allying with foreign countries is a terrible idea. Let's never do it again. No more peacetime alliances. Maybe wartime alliances, but Americans weren't really thinking seriously about wars. They figured that they were far enough from other countries that there wouldn't be wars. Anyway, let's just forget this alliance stuff. So this is important because the alliance with France, the American alliance with France, ended in 1800. It would not be for 149 years until 1949, that the United States embarked on another peacetime alliance. This would be NATO, of which we'll hear more presently. Anyway, so neutral rights, this problem of sort of defending America's neutral rights, this was an issue for Americans. But it was an issue mostly for Americans who lived near the seaports, and a lot of Americans did, and in the trading regions of the country, for example, New England. The second feature of American foreign policy in these early years was westward expansion. This would be a consistent theme, a constant refrain from the very beginning until the 1860s, and we'll see it end in a little bit. But anyway, so neutral rights, westward expansion. For the most part, westward expansion had to do with the Native Americans who were living in the region in which American settlers were expanding. And whether this constituted foreign policy or domestic policy was a little bit unclear because the United States government did not recognize the Indians as foreign nations. They were sort of, eventually the Supreme Court would call them dependent, domestic nations, whatever in the world that means. Now, from the standpoint of the Indians, there were these foreigners who were coming into their territory. And there were ongoing negotiations sometimes, diplomacy, very often battles, sometimes just raised, sometimes very informal, sometimes organized. But the biggest theme of American external relations, I guess I'll call it, is pushing westward. And this would include the acquisition of territory by purchase. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson and Congress purchased Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory, basically the western half of the Mississippi Valley from France. So it was a purchase. The Indians who lived there weren't consulted, but nonetheless, the European powers now acknowledged that the United States held title, whatever that meant, to this very large portion of North America. So as of 1803, American boundaries go from the Atlantic Ocean to the crest of the Rocky Mountains. So that's already a big expansion. In 1776, the colonies were just huddled on the Atlantic shore. Now they go into the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, Missouri valleys, and to the crest of the Rocky Mountains. There were still matters to be worked out with Britain. What about Canada? What about claims on the west coast, the Oregon country, with Spain, which until 1819 controlled Florida? Gradually, the United States would extinguish, basically push the Spanish out of Florida. That's part of the expansion scheme. The United States repeatedly tried to push the British out of Canada. That part didn't succeed. But anyway, so American defense of neutral rights and American dreams of westward expansion combined to produce the War of 1812. This is America's first war, first regular war, post the Revolutionary War. The United States goes to war against Britain in defense of America's neutral rights. The Republicans are now in charge, so they're the ones who are anti-Britain. They could almost as easily have gone to war against France, because the French were doing much the same thing. But they were Republicans, they were opposed to Britain, so it was Britain they went after. So it was because of depredations against American neutral rights, American trade, they were seizing American vessels, seizing American sailors, but also on behalf of westward expansion, because Westerners in particular wanted to expand America's territory to the northwest into Canada. So Westerners considered sort of Canada fair game. If you lived in Kentucky, the Ohio Valley, the part north of the Ohio River is already part of the United States, but up beyond the lakes, this was British Canadian territory. And so there was this idea that the United States would conquer Britain and basically secure America's northern border, because as long as that lay in the possession of Britain, then the British, if they should ever want to attack the United States, could go up the St. Lawrence River and come down the Hudson River and attack New York, which is what they did during the Revolutionary War and what Americans had to worry about during the War of 1812. And because Spain was an ally of Britain, declaring war on Britain meant that Westerners and Southerners might actually get Florida as well. So there was this whole expansionist notion. Now, the War of 1812 was not a success. It ended in a tie, a draw. And the basis for the treaty at the end of the war was something called the status quo ante bellum, the way things were before the war. And it really was just well, okay, no big deal. Now, the reason that this would be okay is that the causes of the British infringements on American neutral rights ended when the Napoleonic Wars in Europe ended with the defeat of Napoleon. So the wars of the French Revolution gave rise to the Napoleonic Wars. But this almost constant series of wars from 1793 to 1815. In 1814 is when the war first ends. Napoleon makes a comeback and he's finally put away in 1815. But with the end of that, the British, and for that matter the French, have no particular incentive, no reason to infringe on American neutral rights. So although the war ends in a tie, it's almost as good as a victory for the United States. And the Americans come out of this with a big win in one battle at the Battle of New Orleans, which gives America its first post-George Washington great military hero, Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, just like George Washington, will be rewarded with the presidency. So for the next 20 years, Americans are kind of absorbing this. They're expanding. They aren't actually pushing out their boundaries. There was a treaty in 1819 which made clear what the boundaries between American and Spanish territory were. The United States gains Florida, and it's a little bit unclear where the boundary between American and Spanish territory in northern Mexico is. And but they draw a line there, and so this is something that's going to come up in the future. Well, except it's not between the United States and Spain. It's going to be between the United States and Mexico, because by this time Mexico, following America's anti-imperialist, nationalist lead in America's war with Britain, starts a war against Spain for Mexican independence, which succeeds, ends in Mexican independence in 1821. So now the United States has not Spain as a neighbor anymore, but Mexico. And so Americans, well, they're still thinking expansively. And over the course of the next 25 years, Americans are going to be looking in the direction of Mexico. First in Texas. Texas at this time was part of Mexico, but beyond Texas was California. And it's a matter of growing American population and growing American ambition that leads to, well, first, there's a revolution by Americans in Texas against Mexico to tear Texas away from Mexico. The whole idea was then to annex Texas to the United States, but that got hung up when anti-slavery elements in Congress said, no, we don't want any more slave states, and not as many as Texas might be, because Texas was this really big territory, and it was thought that Texas might spin off several states, presumably all slave states. So the Texas's admission to the United States was blocked for nearly a decade. It would be resolved as a result of a war with Mexico in 1846 to 1848. So I said that the two themes were neutral rights. Well, neutral rights are largely resolved as of 1815, the end of the European wars. Territorial expansion, now this goes on almost unabated, and it gives rise to a war between the United States and Mexico in the 1840s. It was partly over Texas. Texas claimed independence, but Mexico still said, no, we still got Texas. And so there was a dispute over the Texas border, which gave rise to the war, directly a war between the United States and Mexico. But the underlying reason for the American desire for a war with Mexico, because Americans basically considered Texas a done deal. What the American administration of James Polk wanted was California, and California was definitely part of Mexico. So the war took place between 1846 and 1848 and ended with American possession of the entire Southwest, including Texas. In American history, there was never more clearly a war of expansionist aggression. A whole lot of people in the United States, including Abraham Lincoln, who was then a congressman from Illinois, Ulysses Grant, who was a soldier in the U.S. Army, thought that the war with Mexico was unjust, it was unethical, it was immoral, and all of this. So, but nonetheless, the war ended with this huge expansion of American territory. At about the same time, in 1846, the United States settled an ongoing debate with Britain over who was going to control the Oregon Country. The Oregon Country was the northwestern part of the United States, what's now the northwestern part of the United States, plus British Columbia. It went all the way up to what's the southern border of Canada now. And that one ended in a compromise. And the compromise was that the boundary between British Canada and the United States would be, well, roughly where it is now. so that British Columbia would still be British Canada, and what would become the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, a little bit of Montana, would become American territory. So as of 1848, at this point, America's sort of territorial expanse is pretty well rounded out. There's going to be a minor addition in the 1850s where the United States purchases a bit of territory on the southern border, the border with Mexico, because it was thought to have a good railroad route called the Gadsden Purchase. And then in 1867, we're jumping ahead of the Civil War, but in 1867 the United States would purchase Alaska from Russia. This was kind of looking toward the future, and Alaska might be a stepping stone to East Asia. And if you look on a globe rather than a flat map, you'll see that it is. If you're taking a boat, a ship, from San Francisco to Japan, you're actually going to swing, because of the curvature of the Earth, you're going to swing pretty close to Alaska. And so it was seen as a logical stepping stone. It was also seen at the time as a way to put the squeeze on the west, at least the western part of Canada, and maybe force the British ultimately out of Canada. That didn't work, and the United States was left with this big piece of territory, Alaska, that was not connected to the United States. And at that point, American territorial expansion screeched to a halt, with some minor exceptions that'll come along at the very end of the century. And the reason it did is not that Americans suddenly said, oh, enough is enough, or that at least they said, you know what, we should stop being so aggressive toward our neighbors. It had everything to do with the underlying changes in the American economy, which brings us to what I call, half seriously, half jokingly, one of Brands' laws of history. I have these laws of history, and the first of Brands' laws of history is that there are no laws of history. So you see that you shouldn't take it too seriously. And when I say there are no laws of history, I say there are no laws like laws of physics, but there are patterns. And this is what historians look for. They don't look for ironclad laws that predict definitively what's going to happen next. But you can kind of look at things and see what might be coming. So Brands' fourth law of history, and this is the one that I think has real applicability. It's been demonstrated time and time again. Brands' fourth law of history is that sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. So this is a link between the power of an economy and the ambition of a foreign policy. And during the second half of the 19th century, from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1900, the United States was gearing up its economy. Industrialization had taken full hold, and Americans were going to become, by the end of the century, the most powerful people in the world economically. The American economy in 1900 was the marvel of the world. The United States had the largest, most powerful economy in the world by 1900. And what does this mean, according to Brands' fourth law of history? Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policies they can afford. By 1900, the United States had an economy that could afford a more ambitious foreign policy than any other country on earth. But the sooner or later part of the law is very important. And so more on this in a moment. Basically what it means is there's often a time lag between what countries can afford and the foreign policies they get. So we'll come back to that. But as to why American territorial expansion suddenly stopped, it had everything to do with what was going on in the economy. The American economy was industrializing. The American economy in the first half of the 19th century, in the 18th century before that, was an agrarian economy. It was based on farming. What do farmers need? Farmers don't need jobs. Exactly what farmers need is land. Land provides the basis for an agricultural economy. By the end of the 19th century, America had an industrial economy. And industrial economies don't need more land. What they need is more resources sometimes. Mostly they need more markets, but they don't need more land. And so the reason that American territorial expansion suddenly stopped in the 1860s was that Americans no longer needed that land for future generations of farmers because the farm population was actually shrinking. It wasn't growing as it had been back in Jefferson's day when Jefferson thought the Louisiana Purchase was a great thing. So this is why American territorial expansion stops. I've explained why America's insistence on neutral rights stopped, or at least it went into abeyance, because nobody was bothering America's neutral rights. In fact, one of the striking things about American foreign policy in the 19th century was the fact that European policy was pretty quiet. Europe had a whole bunch of wars during the 1600s, 1700s, the early 1800s, but they they had just a handful of much smaller wars in the 1800s. So from 1815 to 1914, there was nothing like the series and extent of the wars of the 1700s. And so they had no particular reason to bother the United States, and they pretty much didn't. So neutral rights, this had been one theme of American policy in the 18th and early 19th century, but there was no reason to worry about it too much after 1815. Westward expansion, this was a big deal in the 1700s and in the 1800s to 1867. And then poof, this kind of stopped. So what does America do? What does America do in foreign policy? Well, not much actually between the 1860s and the 1890s. By the 1890s, some Americans are starting to think, you know what, this expansion stuff, it was a good deal because it always gave us something to work toward. It always gave us a safety valve for our population to go farther west. Well, we're probably not going to claim any more land, but maybe we can, just sort of grab some spots, grab some influence. It was a time when the European powers weren't fighting each other in Europe, but they were competing with each other for colonies in Africa, in Asia, in the unclaimed parts of the world. And then some Americans looked at this and got, sort of empire envy, thinking that, well, gee, if all these other countries are developing big empires, maybe we should too. Not that there was any compelling need for the United States to do it, but maybe they know something we don't know. So some Americans began to think we ought to have this empire. Others thought, what we really need to do is to demonstrate our influence in world affairs. They were catching on to this idea, although they didn't put it in these terms, that we're rich now. We can have an ambitious foreign policy. So the United States, in the thinking of some people like Theodore Roosevelt, we need to sort of assert our influence in the world. An opportunity came in the late 1890s when Cuban nationalists, that is, Cuba was still a colony of Spain, and Cuban nationalists who wanted independence, they rose in rebellion against Spain. And the Americans who wanted an empire for the United States, who wanted America to show its influence, and there were some who just wanted to relieve the suffering of the Cuban people, said, we need to go to war and throw the Spanish out of Cuba. And eventually they beat the drums for war loudly enough that war came. William McKinley sent a battleship to Cuba, and the battleship blew up. It was almost certainly an accident, but the war hawks, the people who were in favor of war, they said, no, the Spanish, those dastardly Spaniards, they did this, and we need revenge. So the United States went to war against Spain in Cuba. Well, went to war against Spain. Most Americans thought it was about stuff in Cuba. There were a few, the expansionist-minded, like Theodore Roosevelt, realized that Spain had this large colonial empire. And so, in fact, Americans woke up one morning, not long after the declaration of war, and discovered that an American battle fleet had defeated a Spanish fleet in the Philippines, in Manila Bay, in the Philippines. And most Americans hardly knew that the Philippines were part of the Spanish Empire because the United States had declared war against Spain. Well, that meant everything Spanish was fair game. So the United States won this quick war against Spain. And at the end of the war, it found itself in control of this overseas empire, chiefly the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and a couple of other minor spots. But the question was, what do we do with this? And there was a big debate in the United States. And big debates in the United States over foreign policy are rare. But when they happen, they're often significant. And this debate in 1899 was, should the United States become an empire? The United States had been a republic until now, but should it become an empire? And some said, yeah, this is the way of the future. This is what the world is doing. The United States is going to be a big world power. They're thinking, sooner or later every country gets a foreign policy it can afford, and we can afford this, so we're going to do it. The anti-imperialists said, this is not in the spirit of the United States. We were born in opposition to empire. We were born out of an anti-imperial revolt. We will not make good imperialists. We don't want to be imperialists. Well, at the moment, the imperialist side won, and a treaty was signed, and it was ratified by the Senate, that made the United States the colonial overseer of the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Almost immediately, Americans began to have second thoughts because the Filipinos, in particular, rose in rebellion against the United States. The United States eventually was able to put down the rebellion, and the war ended, and the United States entered the 20th century as a republic, but also now an empire. And many Americans are trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this? Where are we going to head going forward? We'll see in the next installment.